Well, so many surprises here on this hot July day, at least for me in New Jersey. Where are you guys, Michael? Where are you guys?
We are in Tennessee. We recently fled Mussolini's hellscapes, Gomorrah by the sea, and so now we're in the land of the free.
That explains the sweater then, because it's obviously much colder. No, I know actually that television studios can be chilly places, especially for a skinny boy.
For a skinny boy, that's my official title.
That's right, which I relinquished to Michael, by the way. So everyone by now is on to what's going on here. So first of all, two things. One is that we've got Michael Knowles, the Renaissance man of, what was it? I keep forgetting, of something. Of podcasting or of whatever it is you do.
I'll take it. I'm not quite sure. That's why they say Renaissance man. It's like, he does a little of this and a little of that, a little.
Well, I had a friend in college who was very insulted because one of our other friends said, David, you do like everything, but you don't do anything really, really well.
Yeah.
And for some reason, David, who became actually a very, very good orthopedic surgeon, didn't take it very well to it. Look, this is the ColemanNation. I don't know, Michael, if you picked up on the on the pun, the last podcast ever, ColemanNation, end of the world kind of tones. We're doing the first ever video here because when we came online, I always like to say hi to my guests by video, especially someone like Michael, with whom I have only interacted, and even then lightly, on Twitter before. We've never met in person. So, say hi, and then I can claim that I know him. And then we saw that, as I put it, they were shellacking his hair. And I just have to warn you, Michael, that's not going to...
It doesn't stay. It doesn't.
Believe me, in the 70s, the things that I put on my hair, well, So we decided to make this our first ever experiment with video podcasting, and I thank you very much for being my guest. And because you are you are actually a person who does all kinds of things, and it is actually fascinating to me. You had a background in acting. I was also a college actor, although I didn't go to a college that had an acting major. Not that my parents would have let me major in acting in a million.
Right.
In fact, even being successful in acting at Princeton scared the hell out of them.
Yeah.
But you seem to be very comfortable in front of the camera. And
I always enjoyed acting, and I always enjoyed politics, and I really started in them both around the same time. I, too, would not have majored in acting. I felt that was a great way to sort of set a lot of money on fire. So I majored in history and Italian literature, much more practical, useful majors. But I did do a lot of acting, and I acted professionally a bit after college, but please don't hold it against me. But it is how I found my way to Hollywood. I was out there doing, very low budget sorts of movies and things, and found my way into this circle of these misfits in Hollywood who we called ourselves the Friends of Abe. And it was those, in the 50s, you had the Friends of Dorothy if you were gay, and and now you have the Friends of Abe if you're a Republican in Hollywood, because you've got to be very secret.
Abe Lincoln?
Abe Lincoln. And
so you're also gay.
Yeah, that's true.
Right?
That's true. We called it the log cabin. I don't know what it was. But we did, and that was kind of how we hooked up with with Jeremy and Ben and Andrew Klavan, and the Daily Wire was sort of born out of that.
Wow, that's because you're actually your voice actor.
I joke that the only people who ever hire me as an actor anymore are Andrew Klavan and Ted Cruz. Those are the ones that I continue. So I do enjoy doing that. I read my own book, Speechless, recently. I've read some books for Andrew Klavan, his audiobook. And the thing I really like about audiobooks, by the way, compared to movies or TV or plays or something, is it's a real job. It's like an actual job with requirements and hours that you work, whereas, movies can be the craziest thing.
Oh, you mean audiobook gigs?
Yes.
Wait, should Michael Malice have paid me? I'm not union. I just read a chapter for his book.
Oh, terrific!
But he's a little bit insane.
Yeah.
And the further I got into this chapter, which I found very intriguing, it was about the legal regime and about what it was like this highly legal realism-y thing. And the more I got into it, the more I hated what the guy was saying. But I have to still be in character. And I actually have a background in college radio. This is not about me talking about me, but I do like to connect with my guests, and we can't connect about hair or Italian literature. So I have a background in radio, and I also took professional voice lessons in a vain attempt to get out of the legal profession many years ago. But so he got me to do this chapter, and I had to stay in character, and be still an enthusiastic believer in what I was saying, even as the 2 hour, you start, this. How long can you go before you'll see when you're old, you dry out a lot faster.
Eventually you run out. I studied back when I was a young actor, a wee lad. I was studying with this very legendary acting coach. He was a famous teacher named Win Handman. And at the time he was 92. He lived to be 97 or 98. And, this guy was Frank Langella's acting teacher. Frank Langella's, himself 1,000 years older. We're going even further. He directed Myrna Loy and all of these sorts of crazy people. And he was legendary in that virtually any really serious major star actor around these days for the past 50 years studied with this guy. And, really serious people that I admired. And I was in his studio and we were chatting one day, and he said, "Michael, you're too interested in being smart." He said, "To be an actor, you have to be a gullible fool." And he meant it. He wasn't being insulting. He really loved actors, but you have to be very suggestible to the circumstances of the play or of the movie. And I think this is actually why Ronald Reagan famously was asked, "Can an actor be president?" He said, how can the president not be an actor?" And what he's saying is that politicians, too, need to be suggestible. They need to be reacting to real circumstances that are changing. They have to like people, and enjoy what makes people tick. And so I do think there are a lot of similarities there.
I think you're right. And I also, there's a certain amount of ego that...
Just a touch in those professions.
Let's call it self-possession. Yeah. Okay, let's call it because sometimes people say to me in fits of charity, "Ron, why don't you run for office?" And I say, "Can you just imagine talking about yourself, even more than someone who's on Twitter with 135,000 followers does, right? And referring to yourself in the third person, like Bob Dole kind of a little bit overdid it, but you just actually also touched on something else that I found for some reason. By the way, the theme of the podcast is the theme of your book. But now that I know we have much more time than I thought, the book is Speechless by Michael Knowles, available at fine booksellers everywhere. We'll talk about that, believe me. But somehow I found myself on a sleepless night, because I do have the weight of the world on my shoulders, Michael, reading about the life of Burt Reynolds.
Okay.
And he really presents an interesting, he wasn't as dumb as the Celebrity Jeopardy depiction would suggest. Right. But it seems to be a real question as to how serious of an actor he actually, you're hearing him, having taken some acting when I was in college, I know, the words, the being in the moment and the truth, all the kind of keys, the method talk. And he clearly was a professional and clearly took, but the way he pissed away his career in endless car chase movies, which you can't take anyone serious. But then he comes back and has this last moment as a porn film director. There was something about that sincerity that really registered with me, because I was always puzzled by him. And when I was growing up, he was really the man. Yeah, he was so absolutely the man. And because obviously identified with him very much.
Don't we all? Just one.
Michael, you are all over the place, and you seem to have a great deal of energy and so much to say about what's going on. But what you've chosen to focus on, and the reason I thought that you'd be a good guest for this, besides the fact that you're charming and handsome and
go on
young, and you take that. What won't you take? Actually, is that you decided, of all the things that are going on, to write about political correctness, and I was struggling with this because now that I've done 14 or so episodes of this brand new podcast, I'm starting to what I have been happy to hear is that most of my guests, and I've had some pretty snazzy guests, is that I'm hearing different things from a lot of them. And even when I was on Tim Pool's show 2 weeks ago, I'm going to just drop so many names.
Yeah. You know, maybe you know my friend Barack Obama. Have you heard it?
Well,
yeah, I would never call him a friend. I would, yeah.
Michelle was in my class.
Oh, at Princeton, right?
Class of '85.
Mm-hmm.
But by virtue of being an African American, we never saw each other because by that time already,
wow,
most African American students at Princeton were self-segregating very intensely.
Wow,
and we never no interaction whatsoever. In any event, what I was saying was about the speech that people have different perspectives, are saying a lot of different things about this, and when I was kind of looking for the hook on Michael Knowles, like what's going to be his take on this? What's going to be, and what I have found, by the way, in my research is that in the course or in my experiences doing this is that I'll do a little bit of research, and I do mean a very little bit of research. Inevitably, what my guests have to say about this topic is not what I expected.
Yeah.
Because people who've gone to the trouble of writing a whole book and even putting a picture on the front of it.
I know, look at that.
Have really, I mean, you probably spent like weeks on this thing, right?
Oh, I spent hours. You know, at least, I mean, nearly a day. Yeah.
I mean, all that cutting and pasting. But you're a unique person with a unique background, and of course, you started with the Italian Renaissance aspects of this, I'm sure, in order to draw on your background. Actually, I'll be interested in hearing. Look, we're liberal arts graduates. Okay, we don't believe that you go to college. I mean, maybe you'll tell me differently. I still think that when I went to college in the '80s, you got a liberal arts education, and it was a liberal arts education. I'm an economics major.
Yeah.
I can not balance my checkbook, right, but it's an excellent preparation for, in fact, there was a number of studies that economics majors are like the best prepared undergraduates among non-scientists.
You know, I'm so glad to hear you say this because it really does drive me up a wall. Look, I agree the universities are terrible. They've been utterly hollowed out. They are just tools of the liberal regime. They probably need to be broken into rubble and have the earth salted underneath them. But I sometimes hear conservatives say that if you go to college, you should only go to college if you major in engineering or some very practical major. And I think, what are you talking about? The conservative view, I mean, the kind of the beating heart of conservatism that passes it along is a liberal education. It's the humanities. It's understanding what our civilization is and cultivating that which is best to make sense of our freedom.
And William F. Buckley never would have said that, besides the fact that he criticized Yale. And he came into the public eye criticizing the way the liberal academy treated the Western canon and all the things that fill the lives of Michael Knowles as a profession and Ron Coleman as an avocation. He nonetheless would. But then again, he died before he had to see any of the stuff that goes on.
You know, that book I think is important too because I was just rereading it. I've got an introduction to it coming out. It's the 70th anniversary this year that's coming. Cool. It'll come out in a couple of months. And so I hadn't revisited it in quite some time. And you really forget these days, given how far even the conservatives have moved left, you kind of forget what a serious man Bill Buckley was. And everyone remembers the title. The title is God and Man at Yale. Very few people remember the subtitle, which is The Superstitions of Academic Freedom. And he puts academic freedom in quotes. And in that book, he refers to academic freedom as a hoax. He says it's not a real thing. It's just basically a tool that the left uses to hollow out the educational standards and reset them in their own favor. He says the Yale sociology department would never hire a neo-Nazi to lecture on the superiority of the Aryan man, nor should they. Universities have a mission. There's a difference between true and false and right and wrong. And this is true, I think, throughout the culture. It's actually one of the things that I really struck me writing this book, Speechless, was we have bought so much of the left's sloganeering on, be it academic freedom or on free speech absolutism or what have you, and we've totally abandoned our standards. We've totally abandoned the idea that education is actually coercive and it actually is guiding you to cultivating your rational will and tamping down your base passions and really elevating yourself into a true liberty that requires limits.
So I had a discussion along those lines with Sohrab Ahmari last week, who, somewhat like you, but from a very different background, came to Catholicism. Now you came back to Catholicism, as I came back to Judaism. So we had a lot to talk about this idea that there should be, I mean, you said, I hardly ever do this, but I found a quote from you in one of your videos. And I watched like a total of 46 seconds of your entire, That's French, right? Okay. Free speech in the abstract means absolutely nothing to people who have nothing to say. You nailed it.
Yeah.
You nailed it. Because these people, and this is something that Mrs. Coleman and I are always talking about, what we're fighting is nihilism.
Yeah.
It's nihilism, and and one of the advantages they have, besides the ruthlessness and besides the institutional method, all the things again that we're also tired of hearing ourselves talk about, is that it is so much easier to destroy than to build. And this is a theme in, I mean, the Western tradition and the Judeo-Christian tradition have always been vulnerable to that, because whenever you're trying to build something, it's easy to throw rocks at it, and it's easy to second guess it. But I realized many years, internet polemics have been like back in the blogging days. It was just something I was instantly found a way to ruin my life with the internet. And one of the things I started realizing was that almost everyone who had a criticism of some kind of institution or philosophy virtually never had anything like a coherent alternative in mind.
Yeah.
What do we do about that? They're not going to become. So I asked this question to him, and you may have the same answer. You might have a different one. The whole thing about culture upstream,
right? The Breitbart
politics,
maxim.
Yeah.
So
people aren't going to become religious believers, are they? And if what's
my answer might be slightly different than Sohrab. I talk about Sohrab in this book, and actually he was kind enough to blurb this book. But my answer might be slightly more modest. He has an excellent line in that essay where he was attacking David French, and he has a great line where he says, ultimately we need to recognize that society will be oriented toward some conception of the good and, ultimately toward the highest good. So when, for instance, to get to the David French-Sohrab debate, when David says that Drag Queen Story Hour is one of the blessings of liberty, first of all, you can hear James Madison rolling over in his grave. But second of all,
I knew
there was the little rumble in the back. And so I guess David's argument, the most charitable read I can take on it is, if we tell drag queens that they can't twerk for little toddlers at the library, why then they might tell us that we can't go to church on Sunday. And first of all, just as a practical matter, they already told us this. And actually, as is often the case, the Jews bore a little more of the brunt of this. In New York, you had de Blasio and Cuomo threatening to permanently shut down synagogues if Jews kept showing up to their services.
I sued them both.
So, I mean, this was, practically speaking, they were already doing it. But moreover, if you really believe that we cannot discern between a pervert twerking for 3-year-olds and showing up to church on Sunday, if you truly believe that, and you're not just spouting off like a freshman philosophy major, but you really believe that you do not possess the faculties of reason or the moral conscience to discern even that clarity between right and wrong and true and false and good and bad, okay, then you at least need to acknowledge that self-government is not possible, because self-government requires those faculties of reason and moral conscience. We must be able to do that. And so then the question becomes, how does one have a society that at least recognizes that there's such a thing as truth and goodness and beauty and virtue? And there is the Catholic integralist answer, which I'm not knocking at all. I think it's a perfectly coherent answer, which is submit to Pontifex, and we'll have the Empire of Our Lady of Guadalupe in the Americas, and then it'll all work out. Okay, would that it were so simple, to quote that movie Hail Caesar, one of the most conservative movies and such a faith-filled movie of the last decade. Short of that, though, if we're not going to get that just yet, what about the virtue of prudence? This is a virtue we are not allowed to discuss anymore. It's sort of the conservative virtue, but we're now told no. If your vision of politics is not a 5-point ideology that you can write on the back of a napkin, then it won't be good enough for me. It needs to be clear. Well, my friend Father George Rutler says shallows are clear. Shallow thinking is clear. Prudence is something that's a little bit murkier. We're learning from the wisdom of the ages. We're learning from what has worked in the past, what has worked to give us this free speech regime in America that's not absolute, it's not pie in the sky, it has certain limits, but gosh darn it, I like the way it's worked. I think if we can draw on that practical experience and our prudence, I think we will have a chance to steer the ship of state a little bit more in the right direction. And the ideologues on the left and right will yell and cry and scream, but that's good. That means we're doing something right.
Well, I recently had the occasion to pick up a book that had been on my bookshelf forever. I had originally bought it with the intention, it's a little book, by Charles Murray, and it's about being a curmudgeon's guide to something, and it's meant to be a book of advice for young people, getting their first jobs and how to deal with curmudgeons such as Charles Murray. And I ended up not recommending that my sons read the book because it's so completely inapplicable to them in their cultural milieu. Another French Italian Renaissance word. It's just so irrelevant. It would require me another a half-hour YouTube just to explain why. But I read it. So I read it myself. It was a really fast read. And one of the things he says is he's not what you'd call a man of faith as such. But he said he recognized that our society is built on faith, on creed, and that there's a certain stability and humility that comes with attaching yourself to the faith tradition that's somehow relevant to your culture. And he started attending meetings with his wife, who was a Quaker. And he has not become a Quaker, but he has said, I've been surprised at how much of it has seeped in and how much of it has become meaningful to me. And what he was telling his young readers was, you have been told since, well, even before college, what a joke religion is and people of faith are. And you must appreciate something that you're probably not, they're not going to tell you, but I'm going to tell you. People like Michael Knowles are out there who are pretty sharp themselves and who've thought about this and who are nonetheless, and William F. Buckley, if you'll excuse me the comparison, St. William, right? Patron saint of cultural conservatives.
That's right. Yes, I know. I've been trying to work on my accent, but it's not. I don't quite have I'm a little too Italian for the Mid-Atlantic accent, I think.
And the
William F. Buckley Jr.
One of the things he says in that book about here's one of the things that astonished me about that book was that one of the things one of my own little culminations was, parents, your children are not, I have 4 adult children. Thank God, they're fantastic kids. Your children are not they're not you distilled. They're not a fraction of you. They're their own people. There's one thing you can do in raising them. You can't guarantee any outcomes, but you can give them the opportunity to be educated properly. and you can teach them manners. You can teach them manners. And one of the things Murray says in this book is there's no such thing as anyone who has manners anymore. The last people with true, what passes for manners now is saying please and thank you. Ooh, yeah. Please and thank you. Which, by the way, you can't even get when you go to 7-Eleven. Yeah. Have a good day is the max. Thank you for giving us your money is not even on the table. But he said William F. Buckley and his brother James were the last people in his circle, and it's quite a circle, who absolutely knew manners. Yeah. When someone comes into the room, you stand up. Yeah. And the way that, and of course, we Orthodox Jews who live in this sort of medieval time, or like our children have we have as part of our religious code, maintained a lot of the things that were traditionally associated with those sorts of graces. But these things, going back to the nihilism attacks those fine points as well. Yeah. And I even think it includes the way people dress. Yeah. I drove past a Catholic church in my neighborhood. I live in Clifton, New Jersey, which is everyone who is not Jewish is Catholic, and it's far more Catholic. And I drove past on a Sunday, and I saw people coming out of church, and I was astonished. They looked like they were coming out of a football game. Yeah. My experience with church is either Princeton interfaith opening ceremonies, whatever, a convocation, back when I used to go into churches. But that was like it. And TV. And I thought, actually, let me tell you something, Michael. I don't know if have you ever been in a court trial?
Thankfully, I've never been on the stand or anything. But I have been to see a couple. Yeah.
On TV, the courtrooms are always filled with people. Yeah. And they're all dressed to the nines. Yeah. Courtrooms are almost all empty. Yeah. In fact, if the judge sees someone come in, everyone, because the judge is the only one looking at the door. Yeah. You'll see the judge look, and then why is somebody in here? What's going on? Who is that? Is that a reporter? Yeah. Is it, are they coming to kill us? And they're people, everyone's dressed like a slob, just like at the car wash. But when did that stop? When you were a kid, didn't you have some Sunday best?
Yes, of course. And you could see it kind of cracking up a little bit then. But I think this is actually kind of the central point that conservatives are missing on political correctness and free speech. They believe, and I think this is the trap of PC, as a matter of fact. PC sets out to destroy traditional standards of dress, of speech, of behavior, and so the squishes go along with that, and they just say, okay, well, I'll do whatever the new leftist fashion is. But then even the more stalwart conservatives, they'll say, well, no, I oppose the new standard because I'm a free speech absolutist, or you should be able to do and say and wear whatever you want, whenever you want. They abandon standards altogether, and sadly, either one of those reactions is going to advance the purpose of political correctness. I think this is why the harder we fight, the more ground we cede. It wasn't so long ago that conservatives had standards. The problem with political correctness is not that it says you should say certain things and you should say other things. It has a code of speech, but then so does chivalry, right? So does all sorts of standards. The question is, what is the substance? What are we being told to say? Are we being told to be polite to one another, or are we being told to deny and often invert reality? I mean, that seems to me the real poison and the real power of political correctness.
I lost you because I thought you were going to say the opposite. That we all understand that the content, calling black, white, calling men, women, calling something that isn't marriage, that's the real poison, and that matters far more than the style or the framing. But our point just now was about how it was that it also matters how you say things and the quality of discourse and literacy and expression, clear expression. In other words, these sort of stuck-up kind of William F. Buckley kind of conservatism, as opposed to the got, God bless us, Alex Jones kind of conservatism, right? Where, much more of a kind of a white collar,
Or a blue collar.
blue collar, a regular guy, which, look, I'm from regular guy people, don't get me wrong. So what did I miss in the transition there? Because you were saying that the squishers say we should have no standards at all. You're saying,
yes, I suppose, I am lumping Buckley and Rush, for instance, or even throw Alex Jones in for that matter. Why not? I think the comparison is a little better, though, with Rush and Buckley. They spoke in very different ways. In some ways, I suppose they held different opinions, but they spoke sometimes to different audiences. But they were upholding a certain cultural standard. They not necessarily in the way they dressed, although, I don't think they were so far apart, but they were recognizing these things are good, these things are bad. And, if we're talking about some aspect of the American tradition, Buckley might express that with some kind of, 7-syllable word and some obscure reference to Baudelaire, and Rush might go a little more to the point and have a few jokes in it. But they're both expressing the same ultimate standard of goodness, truth, and beauty. And what political correctness does is, look, there are people who are politically correct, who are on the left, who are shrieking, yelling horrible things in the streets, bringing their kids to kink parades, right? But then there are also people who show up to, I don't know, the United Nations. There are people who show up to various sophisticated, wonderful groups. They're in the boardrooms of very high-powered organizations, but they still are pushing that same kind of leftist vision. And so in the same way that maybe Buckley and Rush would have a different affect, they still are both pushing a rather perverse idea of the good, the true, and the beautiful, or rather a denial of that, really what you might call an anti-standard. Is it?
Right, because their standard is, look, who are we to say? This was a running joke my brother and I used to have when he followed in my footsteps and also became religious, that you would ultimately, when you would have these sort of ethical discussions with other Jewish people about whether the received tradition is valid, and there would be these various sort of proof dialogues, and ultimately people, you would get to a sort of an obvious moral point, like you use the examples of twerking children. Yeah. We're running out of those.
Yeah,
we're running out of those. Okay, the denominator is getting lower and lower. And ultimately, the other guy would say, well, who are you to say?
Who are you to say, yeah.
And like that facile non-position is, in theory, a response, or it's never a response to anything. Right? It's really a response to nothing.
Yeah.
And I remember, again, during my early days of internet polemic, and I've probably done it even on Twitter, when someone has said, who are you to say? I said, Ron Coleman, American citizen.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
That's who I am to say. I have, and this, actually, Murray deals with this book also in his book also, because he's addressing fundamentally people coming from upper middle class families who have been taught this sort of uses of First Amendment absolutism, and every opinion is of equal value. He said,
yeah,
you're going to go nowhere in life because you've got to make decisions.
Yeah.
You've got to, and decisions are based on distinctions.
Yeah.
And if you don't, and that's, boy, if there's ever one word right now that has lost all meaning, it's distinction.
Well, actually, to go back to our pal Bill Buckley, who's featured heavily in this conversation, Buckley was on an episode of his Firing Line show speaking to Leo Chern in 1966.
I'll play the Bill Buckley part.
Well, you see, Leo Chern, my guest today, I'll smash in his damn face. No. So he's on with Chern, and they're talking about McCarthyism, past, present, and future. And I think a lot of people were shocked to hear the idea, the future of McCarthyism. Buckley had written a book a dozen years prior defending McCarthy. And Leo Chern said, no, but Bill, what I don't understand about you is that the open society is so central to what we both hold dear. We need society to be as open as possible. And Buckley said, no, I don't think so. I do not want the society to be more open. I want the society, in some ways, to be closed. It's no coincidence, by the way, George Soros' foundation, it's called the Open Society Foundation, right? This is a very left-wing idea. And Buckley said, I think that I'm something of an epistemological optimist. There it is. He says, that's the unfortunate phrase to mean, I think we can know some things. I think in any society, some things actually just have to be settled. And so I don't think that we really need to protect the sacred liberties of the Nazi or the communist. You know, we are settling a few things in this society. And of course, his guest was shocked and appalled by this. And I think today many conservatives would be shocked and appalled by this. You know, the ones who defend Drag Queen Story Hour. But some things really do need to be settled.
You know, I'll tell you another example of that guest is we found ourselves with a couple of recent Alan Dershowitz books in our house. Yeah. And they look like he is basically either collecting old columns, which is fine. I learned when I was a freelance writer, everything should be sold 3 times. Yeah. Or he's just talking into a dictaphone over like after dinner because these have the smell, as we say in Yiddish, the schmeck of desktop publishing. Yeah. You know, I mean, but he's just an industry unto himself. But here's a guy who, you know, 20, 30 years ago was gratefully accepting an award from the Atheists Association or Alliance of America. Yeah. And I read this speech and mocking religion, and this is, you know, we've won this cultural battle. And he comes from a very well-known Orthodox Jewish family. Everyone, you know, in the Orthodox world has stories about what they said about Avi Dershowitz, and, you know, when he was in yeshiva. And in the book now, he has all these references to Jewish tradition, which is not an uncommon thing when people reach their dotage. They all of a sudden, you know, their childhood, you know, faith becomes more meaningful and real to them. But he's been the victim of cancel culture. He was smeared, and he has really suffered. And then he compounded that mistake by being such a truth seeker, which is really what he is. Yeah. He just didn't always succeed at finding the truth. But by defending Trump in the last couple of years, partially because of his obsession with defending Israel, which is his idea of as a person who left his tradition, they often, you know, Israel becomes their favorite team that they root for, you know. That's fine, but you can tell in this book that he doesn't quite know what to do with himself because he's Alan Dershowitz, who he considers himself the free speech absolutist, but he's doubling back on the left, the being victimized by the left, that he is one of, if you name 10 people in the middle of the 20th century who had most impact on helping to create that cultural atmosphere, he'd have to be a serious contender for being on that list.
But there's this problem that I think a lot of the free speech absolutists come up against, which is language is intrinsically bounded and exclusive. If a word refers to a thing, it will not refer to the opposite of that thing. And I mean, I suppose there actually are a few cases where there are quirks of language where there makes for confusing conversation. But when a baby says mama, he says mama to distinguish mommy from daddy, right? I mean, this is why the left's war on pronouns is so important. And I think that the squishy conservatives dismiss this at their own peril.
Right. Why die on this hill?
Yeah, who cares?
Why does this?
Yeah. Well, you know who cares? The left cares. The left spends a lot of time and energy and money on it. So something tells me they recognize that words can smuggle in whole premises. Words can smuggle in a whole political vision. The other day, the NFL put out a video. They said the NFL, or football is gay. Football is not only gay, football is transgender. Now that's very strange because gay and transgender imply fairly different understandings of human nature, so it's strange that they can be both at the same time. And then football is this, football is that. Football is everything, they say. But football is not everything. Football is not baseball. Football is not the number 15. Football is not a cup of coffee. But we actually do have to make distinctions in life. And ultimately, we need to make distinctions about truth and falsehood and right and wrong and good and bad. And the left is perfectly willing to do that in its destructive campaign. The right will not. So the right will only make procedural arguments. I defend free speech in the abstract. Well, what does that mean? Do you defend speech that would undermine speech? Do you defend a First Amendment protection for fraud? Surely that's an exercise in speech, but it's speech that undermines speech. So, okay, so now you're limiting fraud. Okay, what about direct threats? That is speech that undermines speech. What about obscenity? Now, it's a little murkier, but I still believe that obscenity is speech that undermines speech. It's why it's not protected by the First Amendment. So, okay, all of it.
In theory.
In theory, yeah.
I mean, the Supreme Court really has left such a nub of obscenity law.
Yeah.
I mean, what they did under Rehnquist is so impossible to understand. It reached, basically, obscenity law reached the point where the only thing that's obscene, it elided into consent, issues of consent. Yeah. Of people being depicted, which, I mean, listen, that genie is not going back in the bottle. I mean, internet, forget it, you know.
And you know what's amazing too is in the 90s, you had a bipartisan consensus on the need to limit obscenity. There was the Communications Decency Act for one. Now it's at the heart of a lot of big tech battles.
Alan Tipper Gore.
Alan Tipper Gore. That's right.
Tipper Gore.
Yeah, I mean, there was another bill. There was the Child Online Protection Act, COPA, and both of them passed with a Republican House, a Democrat Senate, a Democrat President, Alan Tipper right behind it. COPA never really went into effect, and there were challenges, and it kind of lost steam. Today, do you think there is any chance that you could pass something like the Communications Decency Act or COPA? Not a chance. And it's even more recent than all that. You know, a dozen years ago, at the end of the Bush administration, Bush II, we sent a pornographer to federal prison for almost 4 years just for obscenity. The stuff he was putting out was apparently so vile that it wasn't that he possessed child pornography. It wasn't that he raped anybody. It was just obscenity. Now, that would be considered, I think, unthinkable just a dozen years later.
What are we going to do, Michael? What are we going to do, not just in our remaining 5 minutes, but what are we going to do? So we do what we're doing, right? We fight the good fight. I fight it in the courts. You fight it on, the Michael Knowles show, and you've got your book. I should do a book, right? Everyone has a book.
Although I'll tell you, I've written 2 books. No, that's not true. I've published 2 books. One is Speechless, Controlling Words, Controlling Minds. It's got a lot of words in it. The first book, my magnum opus, was Reasons to Vote for Democrats, a comprehensive guide.
I know the punchline, but I'll let you give it.
The lines, it's been done before. Everything men know about women, the wit and wisdom of the German people. Well, mine was Reasons to Vote for Democrats.
Great Jewish sports heroes. You didn't want to say it, but I'll say it.
Great Jewish sports heroes. And so my book has an extensive bibliography, but 250 blank pages. I will tell you, the book with words, harder to put together, and frankly, no more edifying. You know, I felt I really got my thesis out the first time. But on this point of what should we do?
Well, you certainly didn't contradict yourself anywhere in that first book, and that's a remarkable achievement in a work of 250
I know,
pages.
and brevity being the soul of wit doesn't speak highly of this book, I suppose. But what are we?
Oh, that doesn't look like a particularly thick
It's not.
book.
And by the way, I've got about 100 pages of notes because I knew the libs would critique everything that I have to say in here, because I am advancing a different sort of argument. I am advancing the argument that conservatives need to recognize the limits of speech, that we need to recognize that language itself includes a sort of censorship, and we need to set those boundaries. And I think we should set them in accordance with the American tradition and in accordance with right reason and everything else. But we do need to set what those boundaries are. And we will not be able to stop this cultural revolution if all we say is yes, yes, yes. You see this with critical race theory. People say we need to expand the curriculum. Curricula cannot be expanded. There are only so many weeks. There are only so many books you can read in a semester.
And they're not learning anything.
That's right. Right. They're not learning anything. And even worse, if you read something like critical race theory, which is only the latest derivation of poisonous academic movements, a tenet of these movements is that objective reality does not exist, or it's imperceptible, or we can't know anything about it. If you teach a student that, not only are you not expanding his education, you're actually undermining it, because education relies on the existence of reality and our ability to know something about it. So that would be a case where a sort of censorship, I guess you'd call it, a sort of cancel culture, a sort of limiting what's in the curriculum will actually expand one's education. And I know this sort of thought is anathema right now on the right, but people are beginning to realize whatever we've been doing for 30 years has not really worked. And I think even if people are skeptical of my solution, if we know what we're doing now is hurting us, surely I think it's time to try something else.
You know, in almost conclusion, you know, what you were just saying about education and about reality. A couple of years ago, I remember sort of coming upon the realization, which means I instantly said it a million times, that probably the humanities departments of all the state schools should be shut down. They should go back to doing agriculture and science, you know, because that you can justify the taxpayers funding, but it's mostly out of these big state schools that the real garbage was coming out of. Now the Ivy League has caught up big time. But even a couple of years ago, I could still, in good conscience, give my annual $10 to Princeton, you know. And no, they were happy because they were, you know, so many of my classmates are giving much more than that, and I'm the same percentage point as they are in terms of participation. That's somehow meaningful to them. But what we saw in the last year with COVID, or I guess now it's going to be a year and a half, was an attack on what we always thought of were the invulnerable sciences. In other words, we're not even going to have truth. We're not even going to have objective truth anymore in math and biology and medicine. And Facebook and YouTube are going to decide what we as grown adults, supposedly in a free country, can discuss as possible solutions to medical problems. I don't know where this Council of Elders is, where this cabal is that arranges these things. But if you wanted to be, you know, a conspiracy theorist, I mean, the timing of that, when all those words that you're talking about, all those concepts that you're talking about, truth and good and right and bad and evil, trust the science. Why would I trust the science? Science has been a disaster. But your answer might be, I don't even need you for this. Your answer might be, but Ron, the problem is how we define science. And that's not a scientific definition at all. It is that's a humanities definition. Right.
Well, of course. I mean, science refers, properly understood, refers to knowledge. It's just all human knowledge, and we've reduced it so greatly to this merely empirical method of inquiry. And then we've somehow perverted it again into whatever that egghead Mr. Fauci tells us. You know, whatever proclamation he makes. One day he says, "Don't wear the masks." Then he says, "You have to wear the masks." Then you say, "Why aren't you wearing the masks?" Don't pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, and you think, well, if that's the science, I guess I'll have to trust something else.
Michael Knowles, you have truly justified your reputation as a skinny boy.
I'm glad I could live up to it. Even now, being in Nashville, I'm glad that I still hold my reputation as a skinny boy.
Skinny boy, skinny boy. Anything the world needs to know, because this is the big break you've been waiting for. Anything? Speechless.
People, go grab it. It's on the website. Yeah. We found out #1 national bestseller, so you can go check it out. I'm glad people are reading it. I'm glad. I thought people were only going to read my first book, so I'm glad people are reading this now. You can get that. You can watch a Michael Knowles show at the Daily Wire. You can watch the book club at PragerU. You can watch Verdict with Ted Cruz, a podcast that I co-host. And I don't know, you can come watch me outside my bedroom window if you show up to my house in Nashville.
I feel like you're subtweeting me now. All right. Michael, thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.